We're here in the main body of episode 3, and hopefully you found the prelude and with the casino example or the casino study to be useful. I think it's the reason why we spend that much time on that prelude was oftentimes we don't know that we're in a state of disembodiment or mindlessness, and this is all part of the effects of mindlessness and disembodiment, is that we cannot feel those things. They are very hidden from our salience map. So on this main section, I want to take us through the work of, again, Bastian and Lofgren, the moral paradox. And the examples they use is related to eating meat. And the first act with veils is the disappearing act, which is how the veils uses habits to make the harm go away from our salience. And I just want to remind you as an overall map where we're going with this. What we're trying to cover in veils is this right here, this pinch point, veils, and how we starve out our aspirational site S2 by having this lever activate this pinch point, and that lever is activated by eventually habits. So what we're covering here with Bastian and Lofgren's paper is how do habits activate the veils. As you can see, it's tied all the way down to this weigh scale or weigh basket, where habits in these 3 categories right here, and we'll cover those 3 categories later, how by adding more habits, we're actually creating a greater pinch point, which means we're creating a greater starvation of S2 aspirational self. So in a quick takeaway from our prelude, what we had was a high friction situation and they converted into low friction situation, therefore not interrupting the trance of the ludic loop in gamblers, the gambler's ludic loop, as they get into a tunnel vision. So where we're going with this is effectively with the disappearing act, where we bury the harm, we're using habits. As a way of reducing high friction to low friction, and therefore starving out S2, our aspirational self. So effectively what we have as an analogous model is we have an internal engine, or I like to call it an internal casino, which operates on habits. So when we talked in the prelude about the casino, we talked about friction. What is our personal friction related to this habits? I like to propose, and this is again from the work of Bastian and Lofgren, that our friction is dissonance. And dissonance, or cognitive dissonance, is a mental discomfort between an act in conflict with a pre-existing belief. Or it could be a conflict between 2 beliefs. So it's a mental discomfort between an act and belief. Or another variation is 2 beliefs in conflict with each other. So an example would be, I think most of us will relate to this if you own a pet owners out there. not picking up dog poop. So there will be instances, and I'm at the park almost daily fly casting, and I see people with their dogs. And once in a while, I see a person that forgets their bag, and the dog does his business, and they stare at it. They're without a bag. The mindful ones will go asking around for bags. The ones that do not see any other strangers, they just kick it, or they throw a little bit of dirt on top of it with their feet and hurry their dog so that they can get away from the crime scene. So that creates a dissonance. So the first time that you experience that, you might go back and you might feel bad about it. And when you revisit the scene, hey, it reminds you of that act and the dissonance that you experience. The next example is you're an animal lover. But that could be in conflict with the act of eating meat. So for an animal lover, the ideal is that you do no harm and you actually treat them like a family member. But then eating meat is incongruous to it. And we'll deal with how do we become an animal lover as well. How do we eat meat without feeling that dissonance in the later episodes. And we talked about the variation of having two beliefs in conflict with each other. What if you are religious or spiritual, but you also have racist views or racist beliefs? I don't believe any religion or spirituality isolates a group based on race, and also I don't think they're promoting thou shalt hate. So they are incongruous with each other, but then how do people maintain these two ideals or beliefs in them? And how do they overcome that dissonance? So let's get into veils. Again, we're using veils as a way to bury the harm. And the way we do it is veils allows habits as our internal casino to remove situations, or to remove the friction, the high friction in situations to low friction. So with veils, remember the veils we're talking about analogously is related to this. It is our internal casino. And in Bastian and Lofnan's paper, they propose there are two strategies that veils help us bury the harm. The first one is we reduce exposure to harm. So I'll just put down arrow. And what we do is the exposure is reduced with that arrow. And we're actually reducing exposure to the friction of our internal casino, which is in this case is harm. The second strategy is we reduce our sensitivity to that harm, or friction in this case. Sensitivity. So when we're dealing with veils, they are passive avoidance systems. And in today's case, we'll talk about the individual habit that reduces our sensitivity to that harm. And there are three acts that come out of how we reduce sensitivity from the act. And what that three acts do is that the actual enactment leads to and ignoring the implications or the harm, and we eventually become oblivious to it. So in this reduction of sensitivity, the first act is we get desensitized. Then second one is we build immunity around the immorality. And lastly, blind action. And let me explain each one of them in a little more detail. In this column right here, the explanation given by Bastian and Lofton is that when we commit an immoral act, we experience dissonance. However, when we successfully reduce that dissonance for ourselves, so let's say the dog poop, the second time when we commit it, we actually feel less dissonance. And that's how we become desensitized to it. So with here, as we increase the act, we decrease the dissonance, that mental disturbance or conflict we feel and discomfort we feel. And that's how we reduce our dissonance with repeated acts. The second one is immunity, and this is related to dissonance. When we are able to reduce the dissonance repeatedly in ways that allow us to feel, again, to maintain our equanimity, what it does is that as we increase the amount of times we reduce dissonance, the immorality around our actions reduces as well. So what it does is that we build immunity around the immorality as we are able to increase the amount of times as we repeat our dissonance reduction within ourselves. So this is reduction of dissonance, this is reduction of immorality, and that's how they're separate from each other. So then lastly, we get into blind action. And in blind action, we go into automatic mode. And what that does is it increases our mindlessness, but at the same time, it increases our ability to ignore the implications of our very first act right here. So the implications get reduced. We ignore it, and I'll put ignore. So this is the pathway that our habits convert our action into a place where we no longer feel, or we're mindless and we're disembodied from any of the disturbances to our equanimity. So if we were to tie it into the model, or the casino model that we discussed in the prelude, you could say this analogously, these two columns is that disembodiment column that Natasha had laid out for us. Disembodiment. And right here in blind action is our mindlessness. And Bastian and Lofton mentioned that in blind action, there's a study that showed that people ate equal amounts of stale popcorn as fresh popcorn when they're in this mindless state. So there's no discrimination. So this is an act. This is again the pathology or the pathway from act to into the ignoring the implication. This is how we choke off. We can create a pinch point that starts out as to aspirational self. However, is this enough? No, actually not. We need a stable context so that we can repeatedly get into this act to repeatedly build a castle around our act so that we can ignore the implications or the harm from our act itself. So the context, the stable context for that to happen is from maintaining the integrity of our daily existence. And that is broken up into two sections. And for episode 3, I'll be dealing with the habits part 1, and that's the functional side. And the functional side is having to power our lives with calories and energy. So this will be part 1, and episode part 1 that will be dealing with just functional. And the second one is the symbolic, which will be dealing with episode 4. And it goes into ontological security, which I will explain in episode 4. And that is more on the symbolic aspects of our self and how we derive our symbolic sense of security in relating to our surroundings. But this is just purely functional. This is meeting a much concrete, tangible need, which is calories and energy. So on the functional side, as I mentioned, it's powering our lives. And what we have here is high-value food. So one of the habits where we engage in high-value food is eating meat. And the stable context for that is meal times. So meal times 3 times a day, if we eat meat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, it's a stable environment where this act converts to a habit. And the consequence of this pathway of a repeated act with this stable environment that turns into a habit is that we have the habit of ignoring the implications of harm in animal. Another one is, besides high value food, is time and effort savings. So in this case, it would be using cars. Saving time by using car instead of public transportation, or instead of driving, we fly to further distances. There's another aspect besides powering our lives. And this is what I call we supersize our habit. And that's powering our aspirations. That's A. And empowering our aspirations, we are supersizing it by having the aspirations of where there's material betterment for ourselves in terms of a nicer car, a bigger car. I remember the days where there was the oil crunch, oil embargo, there was a move towards smaller cars, and then as the embargo was forgotten by the next generation, people were moving into SUVs, into bigger trucks, etc. So there is this aspiration where when we upgrade our consumption, we also believe that we are bettering ourselves in society, and there's a societal expectations that we reflect through our material enhancements: bigger car, bigger home, nicer place that's further away from the city, a second home, a summer home, etc. So there's material betterment for the self, as well as the aspirations for the next generation. We're trying to leave a legacy behind for the next generation to have better material surroundings. So that's how we supersize our footprint and also supersize our harm in the process. But it drives us into a habit, either by greater impact or greater repetition, and we find ways of driving that or bearing the harm through ignoring the implications. So this provides that stable context, an aspirational context. The next one is hyper-individualism. And the change in how we experience personal space. So in hyper-individualism, again, it's part of the aspirational narrative that we carry in us. It's reflected through we have a bigger home, in terms of personal space. There is less car ride sharing. There is in the hyper-individualism, there is less sharing of resources. That is basically you're supersizing your footprint, your harm, and your ability to ignore the implications through your hyper-individualism and personal space. There's another context that also drives this act right here into habit. And this is a lack of options. So the first one is public transportation. If you don't have good public transportation, it drives down the perception of viable choice. And therefore, we go into car use. Another one is options with non-meat. And Bastian and Lofton suggest that really when we go to a restaurant, we're there to eat, but because there is poor non-meat options, we do not feel that we have a choice, and therefore it becomes an immediate association that eating a meal, eating meat is part of eating a meal, or automatic as eating a meal. And lastly, polarized discourse. And again, I think we all can relate that we are in a situation where topics are being pushed to polar opposites, where the middle ground has been starved. So when we get into a oppositional viewpoint, sharing with a person, let's say a vegetarian, trying to encourage meat eaters to consider alternatives, it becomes an emotional fistfight over ideology. So we have a polarized environment that drives people into a deeper commitment into their extreme behaviors, which leads to greater enactment, greater habits, and therefore a greater ignoring of implications. So relating this model back to the casino model, this stable environment or stable context, which is maintaining the integrity of our daily lives, what it does with the act is that it increases our time on the device. Just like the casino increased the gambler's time on the slot machine, this stable, low friction situation increases our time on the device where we commit the act of gambling, in this case an immoral act, eating meat, car use, flying, etc., without feeling the implications, because we are able to bury the harm. So, relating again back to the casino model, dissonance is that friction. The friction that we talked about in the casino model, and the immorality of either the climate change impact of driving cars or flying or eating meat. With the casino model, I call it the narcissist damage. And what I mean by a narcissist damage is that they basically gamble everybody's winnings. They gamble to the point where everyone is pulled into the loss without them knowing about it. So I had a partner once where, when I met her, her husband had gambled the entire personal savings of the family, put her in a destitute situation where she had to go on welfare, and she had to support the 5 kids. And the fortunate part was the home was titled to the wife, whereas the husband had gambled not only the personal fortunes and the savings, but also money that he extracted out of the company that he worked for. So I call this a narcissist damage. I'd like to wrap up this episode by giving you a preview the next episode what we'll be covering, and that is we'll be looking at a catalyst of how we can enhance the conversion of high friction to low friction situations with habits. But when we add catalyst, it's almost like a booster, and we'll be going through the different peripheral acts that we have related to climate change as a way of keeping us on this time on device as to bearing the harm. Also, we'll conclude this 3 parts here, where we'll be talking, we'll be referencing the S1 here and now state, and S2 aspirational state, in the sense that the S1 is the free market where dopamine is king. We're in a situation where the burden is placed on the individual to curb their appetite, and why it is difficult to use that language onto the aspirational side. And where the aspirational side comes in is that it's a free conscious choice market, and it has friction in the places where it's needed and it's maintained, and there is ethical and reflective consideration that's preserved through that context right there. We also look at how we introduce a tempering of the dopamine, how we spread the supply of our dopamine hits versus concentrating it. And we'll be looking at a comparison, a study comparison by Bruce Alexander called the rat cage versus the rat park scenario, and how managing conditions and settings has a big part to do with how we return the ethical and the reflective considerations. So just for housekeeping, if you like the video, please click on YouTube and also subscribe to the channel. And please post any questions and commentary, and I would take the time between postings to reply, and that would help out people who may have questions but may not have the wherewithal to post it so that everybody could also benefit from it. So I'll see you next week so that we can discuss this advanced part of the habit, internal casino, and also the impact where we can tie in the veil switch to the habit scale. Thank you.